Dr. Zalloua, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start off by exploring the connection between Black and Palestinian liberation. The Black Panther Party, the Black Lives Matter movement, and prominent Black activists like Angela Davis and Malcolm X have expressed solidarity with the Palestinian cause. In what ways do you think the struggles for Black and Palestinian liberation are interconnected?
In multiple, this is a great question, but I think they're connected in multiple ways. I think with Palestine, you have a clear settler colonial context that signals the kind of state terror in a kind of explicit fashion, where the Palestinians are targeted as the enemy, as the terrorists. In the case of the Black Panther, in case of Black Lives Matter chapters, activists, um, you have a kind of the internally colonized model. So if Palestinians are the terrorists, Blacks are the criminals in the United States, in England, and the rest of Europe. So there's a kind of shared solidarity in the way they're oppressed. And at the same time, there's a shared solidarity in what they want to move beyond this kind of framework that deals with racist situations through kind of improvement, through kind of inclusion, a kind of identity politics driven model, which has appealed to some Black liberals. Blacks invested in Black liberalism, civil rights movement. They can see that if you make your case enough, the state will give you more right, will recognize you as a fellow subject. It was done after slavery at the formal level. Then you had Jim Crow. Then you had the civil rights movement. You have Michelle Alexander who's telling us about the new Jim Crow. So the afterlife of slavery persists. So when Blacks, activists, intellectuals look at what's going on with the Palestinians, they say, you know what? We've been on the receiving end of that state terrorism. So we extend our sympathies and we align ourselves with Palestinians and Palestinian resistance, Palestinian liberation, not just Palestinian victimhood. I think these are the kind of obvious connections that I see between the two movements. And Palestinians have seen what's happening in Ferguson at the very, what initiated Black Lives Matter, intensified Black Lives Matter with George Floyd more recently. They were there right from the beginning with Black Lives Matter, knowing full well, right, they'll be on the receiving end of white terror, just like Black activists knew very well they'll be labeled as anti-Semitic. Still, they persisted. Still, they aligned themselves with the other in the name of a kind of political, ethical cause of liberation, equality for all.
Some critics argue that this solidarity is not mutual and the support is not reciprocated. However, we saw like during the Ferguson uprisings that Palestinians offered advice on handling tear gas and police brutality.
Yes.
And we saw Palestinian artists expressing solidarity after the brutal murder of George Floyd.
Yes.
So, can you explain how this solidarity is goes both ways and it's not just a one-way road?
Yeah, I would not put it in any way close to the way you initially formulated. It's not a one way at all. So you give wonderful example for how Palestinians were there, stood with Blacks in moments of crisis, which is a permanent condition, mind you. Um, but shortly after October 7th, when the whole world was clearing the ground for genocide, you had Black Lives Matter chapters saying, no, we refuse this framing of Palestinians as terrorists just fueled by hatred. We have to understand their conditions, their colonial conditions, something we understand quite well coming from the Black community. So I would say Black Lives Matters chapters align themselves quickly. And you mentioned Angela Davis as well, right? Bringing up the issue of Palestine in any articulation of Black liberation. There's no Black liberation without Palestinian liberation, and vice versa, right? For Palestinians to be really liberated, you have to investigate the construction of the human, the investment, the libidinal investment of what it means to be human. So Black Lives Matter is precisely pointing to a fundamental injustice baked in the ontology of the world. Some lives matter, some lives don't matter. And the relationship between the two can be corrected by simply including the people who don't matter with the people who matter. There's a logic which dictates that for me to matter, for Jews, Israeli Jews to matter, for whites to matter, blacks must not matter, must unmatter, Palestinian must unmatter. That has to be dismantled, right? That's the master's house. And the master's tools are precisely the language of rights, inclusion, belonging to a system that is fundamentally racist.
Obviously, nobody can deny the role of Arab countries in the slave trade, but and a lot of people point out to the fact that Afro-Palestinians are referred to as Abid, which means slave.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about anti-Blackness in Israel. In your book, Solidarity and the Palestinian Cause, you mention Ethiopian Jews being given contraceptives against their will and Netanyahu's terrible handling of African migrants in 2018. Can you talk more about how the Black community is treated in Israel?
Yes, I mean, excellent question. I mean, this is something that constantly interests me. How the figure of Blackness interacts with the figure of Jewishness in Israel proper. So you have a kind of racial logic within Israel that divides. So it's not just a kind of ethnocratic state. It's a racist state because it distinguishes among Jews themselves. So you have the Ashkenazi Jew, the Jews that came from Europe, Eastern Europe. You have the Mizrahi Jews, Jews that came from Muslim-dominated countries, and you have a segment of Ethiopian Jews. So they all, in a sense, share the psychological wage of Jewishness. There's something valuable about being Jewish in Israel that puts you above, at a kind of basic ontological level, above any Palestinians, any Palestinian citizens of Israel, and definitely any Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza or in the diaspora. So to be an Ethiopian Jew in Israel is deeply problematic because you have the racist gaze of the Israeli state, a kind of white Zionism, but you also have the ideology that this is a place for Jews exclusively. So there's a kind of benefit, there's a kind of attachment if you're an Ethiopian Jew to align yourself with the Israeli killing machine. So you're probably alluding to the passage that Frank Wilderson evokes when his friend at the time was recounting his experiences in occupied Palestine and how his greatest humiliation was being checked by an Ethiopian soldier. And he reads this as a straight line between the Arab slave and today with his friend. I said many things about this scene, which is deeply complex and requires a lot of multiple interventions. And I always start when I go back to the scene that undoubtedly there's an anti-Blackness involved in his friend. Nobody is immune from anti-Blackness. No Arab is immune from anti-Blackness. No Palestinian is immune from anti-Blackness. Blackness surrounds us, not just at the conscious level, right? We have internalized this anti-Blackness. So the kind of, we have to talk about a collective unconscious that sees Blackness as something to resist, to flee, to fear. So I accept this argument that there is a profound anti-Blackness that surfaces in certain scenes. What I felt was inadequate in Wilderson's account, because this is a kind of primal scene for Wilderson. He returns to it multiple times to describe his transformation from a radical Marxist, right, third world activist to an Afro-pessimist. It's a key moment for him that his friend, in a sense, has more in common with Israelis and whites than he has with him, because at the fundamental level, he shares in the humanity of the Israeli at the cost of the non-humanity of Blacks. But what is missing in Wilderson's analysis is the settler colonial context. No matter how marginalized, ostracized, demonized you are as a Black Ethiopian in Israel, you're better off than Palestinians. And there's a kind of investment. So you're not just your average settler. I think Ethiopians are not just average settlers. right? They migrated there for deep economic turmoil, political turmoil. Israel was trying to change its image, had been seen as Zionism as a form of racism in the United Nations. So they wanted to show the world, look, we welcome Black migrants. So they don't sit easily in the native settler binary. So they're kind of the involuntary migration, not quite involuntary the way slaves were brought here to the United States by force. But once you give an Ethiopian citizen of Israel an arm, a gun, you're closer to the settler than you are to the native, right? I think there's room for solidarity between Blacks in Israel, in Palestine. There's ground for solidarity within them, right? And there's obviously that Wilderson completely ignores is, Afro-Palestinians. They exist, but he ignores them, right? In a sense, their Palestinianness somehow brackets their Blackness, or he just assumes they're Black like any other Black subject. They don't have any kind of attachment to Palestinian identity. I'm not quite sure what he thinks about them because he never talks about them.
Final question, Dr. Zalloua. There is a long history of Black Americans fighting against voter suppression and fighting for their voting rights.
Yeah.
We have recently seen tensions between Kamala Harris's Black voters and pro-Palestine activists. They argue that asking them not to vote for Kamala is infringing upon their right to vote. They argue that domestic issues affecting their lives should take priority over international concerns. And if they don't vote for Kamala, it would bring Trump into power, who would be worse for the Palestinians and worse for them. What are your thoughts on this, given Kamala's stance on Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off by saying I'm not in the business of advising people how to vote, but there are several problematics involved here. I look at this scenario the way you formulated the problem puts you in a forced position. It's a kind of forced choice, either Harris or Trump, right? This is the choice Americans, people, right, living in the United States are given. Citizens of the United States are given this choice, and it seems obvious that you have to choose if you're a Democrat, you're the lesser of two evils. But this logic, there's a kind of perversion in this logic, don't you think? And I mean, we can look at the past. We can look at the Biden-Trump face-off that took place. And one of the kind of narrative here, we had the kind of Uncle Joe, very likable, smiles, approachable, and then you had Predator Trump, his sexual violence. That was the framework, and so people wanted to align with the gentle uncle. Now Uncle Joe, right, became genocide Joe. Harris has been right behind them. So if people are gonna convince vote Harris over Trump, at least formulate it as a difficult choice. That in a sense you're voting for a president that is aligned United States with genocide. Isn't this going to impact your sense of self, your sense of your nation, your sense of your place in the world? That the choice is crystal clear. For me, exhibits a kind of arrogance for the person who's asking it. One who's completely oblivious to the moral bankruptcy of that formulation. That in a sense, there's no attempt that, okay, vote for me, right? But try to convince me, try to put pressure on me, try to put pressure on other politicians so I can maneuver out of that quagmire. But just to formulate as a choice between Trump or Harris, I think is mistaken. It is a kind of ethical catastrophe to just formulate it this way and just bracket the Palestinians and just look at domestic issues. I think domestic issues cannot be ignored. They're a fundamental factor in how we live in this world in the United States. So I don't diminish those rights. We can't, it's not a question of choosing international awareness, Black internationalism, or a kind of local Black liberalism that is attached to Black issues. If you look at the history of Black issues in the United States, it's abysmal. I mean, just ask anybody who is a strong supporter of the Democrats. Name one legislation that happened after George Floyd. Even the George Floyd bill has stalled, which basically wanted to give more money to the police force. Defunding the police, forget it. Nobody even utters it. Harris was a former prosecutor. We have a prison industrial complex. We have a military industrial complex. Does Harris point to an alternative world? Can we provoke her? Can we put pressure? Can we influence her by our votes, by what we say? Can we condition our support for her for change of opinion on key domestic issues and also international issues?
Thank you for your time and insights. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.